And joining us now here in studio, Derek Burleton, Deputy Chief Economist with the TD Bank Group. Derek, good to have you here in the studio.
Nice to be with you.
Let's just, as we consider the state of play in our economy as we head towards Election Day, consider where we've been over the last few years. Starting with the onset of the Great Recession in 2008, how would you characterize how the Ontario economy's performed?
It's performed okay. I don't think we've seen great times. Obviously, it was a very deep recession in Ontario. I think the good news is that the employment losses, and there were a lot of them, have been recouped. We've seen some okay growth, pretty good growth in Ontario. We've seen manufacturing begin to rebound, still at low levels. It's been, I think, under the circumstances, about as good as one could have expected.
We know, of course, that when the U.S. sneezes, we catch pneumonia up here. I want to know what the main structural issues, as you see them, are happening south of the border that are affecting what we're trying to do here.
Well, the patient in the States is still very sick. I see about 3 or 4 real structural problems that are really have even yet to begin to become unwound or reversed. The housing is still in crisis. Foreclosures are still a huge issue in the United States. The banks, as a result, are still not functioning properly. They're unwilling to take risks. And of course, all the talk about the deficit and the debt, it's still a problem that's going to be overhanging that economy for years to come. They're all interrelated, aren't they? But the problem is, particularly the banking system and the housing, it really gets to the lifeline of an economy. So when we talk about a half-speed recovery following a balance sheet crisis, certainly that's the case in the United States. It's going to take a good number of years to get through it, even though it's already been 5 years of tough times stateside.
Are you folks at the bank anticipating a double-dip recession or modest growth, or what coming up?
I think there's a good chance the U.S. will pull out some very modest growth. The risk of a double dip is quite high. I would say about 40%. We need to qualify what that means. The standard definition is 2 consecutive negative quarters. There's a real likelihood that'll happen. When you're operating so close to the line, they're perhaps one financial shock away, whether that be from Europe or somewhere else around the world, that could drive the U.S. into a so-called technical recession. But again, I think that it distracts from the bigger point that whether the U.S. records some modest growth or perhaps slides back a bit, it's still an economy that's still struggling and facing these huge headwinds.
How about here in the province of Ontario? Growth rates over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think so. I think the one thing in Canada is, whereas the U.S., it's like a car with a transmission broken, and it doesn't matter how much gas you put in the tank. The Federal Reserve can have 0 interest rates, and it doesn't seem to stick. In Canada and in Ontario, you can argue that that transmission is still working. The banks are still functioning. Low interest rates help, and I think just the stimulus to the economy and the consumer alone will create that growth. Certainly, we've scaled back the view on exports, and with the high Canadian dollar, I think when you net things out, you're looking at pretty modest growth of about 2%. But I would put the risk of recession about the same, about 40%. Particularly if the U.S. suffers that fate.
How active is the consumer going to be in propelling our economy forward over the next year or two?
Well, there are limits there. We've seen a consumer that's done so much heavy lifting. We've seen the debt loads go up. The housing market has been such a force. I mean, who would have thought with the kind of international headwinds we've had in recent years that housing would have fared well? And it has. But it's left the consumer in a situation where they don't have a lot more gas in the tank. The wage growth, while employment's growing at a decent clip, wage growth is quite minimal, so there are not a lot of personal gains. So my view on the consumer is that they're going to spend at a moderate rate in the next year or so, but the debt loads are going to go up at the same time. And but I think that consumer's got to do the heavy lifting, because without them, exports aren't going to do the heavy lifting we thought they would.
Derek, my hunch is if you read the newspaper every day or you've got the radio on watching television, you would assume that we are going to hell in a handcart at 90 miles an hour. Can you tell us what the Ontario economy actually has going for it at the moment?
Well, I mean, I've already touched on some of them. I mean, we've seen some pretty good growth in Ontario. We've seen employment growth. We've recouped the losses. Manufacturing is beginning to come back. I think one of the brighter spots in the outlook is the outlook for auto sales in the United States. I mean, despite all the problems facing the consumer and low housing prices, falling housing prices, people are still purchasing some cars. We see some growth in auto demand, and I think manufacturing, while it certainly won't be booming, and particularly in the auto sector, I can see some growth there.
But this government is hanging its hat not only on auto, obviously big time, but solar, wind, that kind of stuff. Do you see the kinds of jobs coming in the future that the current government is projecting?
Well, you know, I'm not familiar with the specific government projections. I know from our perspective, we are looking at gains in employment. You know, again, I think we need to keep realistic that if our number one trading partner, the destination of a good 3/4 of the exports here, is not doing well, it's certainly going to keep employment growth at a fairly moderate rate. You know, again, I'm hoping that some of the strengths do bear out, whether it be auto sector. I can see some higher employment. But let's face it, services generate a lot of the jobs here. And with government looking to restraint, that's certainly going to keep a limit on the kind of service sector job creation we're likely to see.
Okay. Regardless of who wins the election on October the 6th, what kinds of policies would you like to see that government take in order to propel job growth?
Well, I think the number one thing, Steve, is that the deficit has to be addressed, and all parties are looking at a longer-term plan to eliminate the deficit by fiscal 17-18. I think we need to stick to that plan.
Is that fast enough?
You know, I think so. You know, obviously, you know, the risk is that something crops up in the interim and throws governments, you know, derails that kind of plan and deficit reduction. But I think I mean, if you look at the extent of challenges to get it there, if you want to keep taxes relatively the same, it means getting spending growth down to a very slow rate of about 1 or 2% a year. Health pressures at 6%. It's a huge challenge, and so you know you got to take that into account. But you know, I think the kind of policies that we're going to need to see out of governments, you know, I think we're going to be looking at governments operating in a period of restraint. So it's going to mean getting more bang for the buck for what they do. Not everybody is going to be able to get. I look at the Ontario drug benefit, for example. It's still a universal program. And that could be an area that the government looks at and says, wait a minute, not everybody should be entitled. You know, in a period of austerity, we're not going to be able to give everything to everyone. And I think that's got to be the kind of mindset we see going forward.
We're starting to see the beginnings of quite a, I hesitate to use the word nasty here, but it's okay. There's a nasty debate percolating right now over the issue of what some people are calling new immigrants getting jobs and what the Conservatives are calling foreign workers getting jobs. Now, leaving aside that whole political angle, which I know is not your thing, on balance, I imagine you guys at the bank have looked at the positive and or negative effects of new immigrants / foreign workers on our economy. What have you come up with?
Well, I mean, I look at it positively in the sense that I see it being on a long-term basis just a huge strength, that we can attract as many skilled workers from around the world as we can. I mean, we're all going to be facing demographic challenges going forward, and an economy's ability to attract migrants like Ontario can is a huge strength. That said, we know the system isn't functioning properly, and to the extent that the new Canadians, the new Ontarians aren't being effectively integrated into the labor force, and it's creating a lot of challenges for these people and for the economy. So I think we need to fix some of the fundamental elements of the system. Obviously, the federal government has a huge role to play in that. They deal with the selection. A lot of the funding for immigrant settlement services comes from the federal government. At the same time, you got Ontario involved in that file. You've got a lot of great services that are cropped up at the community basis. There's a lot of fragmentation, and I think what we need to see is more collaboration across these various components.
Do you have a view as to how business would be expected to react if the Liberals win and if they bring in this new plan to offer a $10,000 subsidy for the hiring of new workers for the purposes of training them so they can get a better job?
Hard to know. You know, it's not something I've had a chance to sort of study other models to see if it works. I mean, you can sort of see where they're coming from with something like this. There is a bit of a market failure, particularly when it comes to small businesses where they don't have the, you know, the ability to assess a lot of credential. Obviously, the educational system of a lot of new migrants, it's difficult for them. So, you know, sometimes financial incentives can help. But that said, hard to know what that right price is. But I get back to what I was talking about just a second ago, is that, you know, there's no quick fix here. Sure. Really, a lot of the solution comes in some of these bigger issues I've spoken of. And foreign credential recognition is one of those that, you know, I think needs to be dealt with. But that, you know, is well beyond the scope of one initiative or two. Mm-hmm.
Well, can we put a couple of issues on the table here? You've mentioned that to get the economy improving, I think you'd like to see some significant deficit reduction. You've talked about, for example, the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan, maybe making it not universal as it is right now. You want to throw a couple more ideas on the table you think could save some money?
Well, you know, I think there will be a lot of ideas. My former boss, Don Drummond, is, of
he's
course,
out there,
he's out there, and you know, everything's on the table, and I look forward to seeing what he sees. You know, the answer comes to looking at all the services. It looks at the assets of government. You know, perhaps the government should be getting out of certain services, and privatization. You know, hard to say. I mean, there have been a lot of ideas thrown on the table. You know, again, there's nothing I can say that's going to add a lot to the debate. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Well, government owns lots of stuff.
Should they own a lot of stuff.
Should they start selling?
You know, sure. I mean, if it doesn't make sense for them to operating, if they can, you know, if it can best be run in the private sector, certainly they should do that. I think, you know, these hard decisions are certainly going to be a part of it. But healthcare is obviously a key plank. And I mentioned the Ontario drug benefit. It's what 45% of provincial spending, and
46, I think.
46,
healthcare.
yeah, it goes up by the minute. But you know, the bottom line is that's obviously got to be a huge issue, and you know, a lot of reforms. We put out our own report talking about some good ideas to restructure the healthcare system.
Do you know when Don's going to be finished that report, incidentally?
It's before the next budget, and I haven't had a chance to speak to him to find out how things are going. But you know, I think the idea is to report ahead of the next budget, and we'll see. I mean, obviously, to the extent these initiatives are put in place will depend a bit on the political feeling of the day, but I certainly hope the government takes a good long look at them.
Just in our last minute and change here, you know, I've talked to many finance ministers in the past, provincial, who say that they can pull every lever at their disposal, and at the end of the day, they can't really influence the economy all that much. So many of the most important levers are either at the federal level or in the private sector. Do you agree with that? Is there actually not that much at the end of the day that the province can do to improve the economy?
I think they can. I mean, they're obviously a huge vital component, and in Canada we've got a very decentralized system where the provinces control a lot more levers than they would in other countries of a subnational government. You know, it's interesting, Steve, that if you look at things that governments could do to improve the playing field. If I'd given, say, 10 years ago, a list of things, improve infrastructure, get rid of that retail sales tax. As an economist, it was just a huge tax on productivity and growth. Improve the investment climate overall. The government's actually implemented quite a few of those, not just Ontario, but in other parts of Canada. That's notwithstanding BC's recent decision to rescind the HST.
What do you think of that decision?
Well, obviously I was disappointed. As an economist, that's something that we've been after, and obviously doesn't make us often the most popular people, but I think it needed to happen. And so Ontario looks like it's going to stay with the plan, and I'm happy about that. But we've created, I think, a very favorable investment climate. So despite all the challenges with the U.S., I am an optimist in that regard. I do see, along with the ability to attract a lot of skilled people, if we can set the right foundation, I do see pretty good growth in Ontario in the future. But obviously there's still a lot of work to do, and this is where we come back to the next government, whoever that might be. I mean, obviously they got to continue to push on many of these fronts, whether it come even in trade. While a lot of it's at the federal level, the province has been involved in negotiations in Europe, and they can be an active player, and that's also got to be a very important piece of the solution.
Gotcha. Derek Burleton from the TD Bank Group, thanks so much for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Thanks, Steve.